Afternoon. Thank you to everyone and welcome to our SDG Academy on Stockholm Plus 50 organized by the Amsterdam Sustainability Institute. My name is Philipp Pattberg and I'm the director of the Amsterdam Sustainability Institute. And I'm super excited to host this discussion today on what we got out of the 50th anniversary of the 1972 meeting of the UN in Stockholm, the first meeting on environment at the UN level, at least at that scale. And it's half a century later that we meet today and discuss what has been achieved, what might have gone wrong, and what we can do about it. So I'm quite excited about the prospects, but also a bit scared. Before I introduce our speakers, I just want to say on a very personal level, it worries me a lot that I see some of the topics that we have already discussed for more than 50 years come back again and again. And that raises, of course, the question, is there any progress in global environmental and sustainability politics? And I'm particularly reminded of a quote that is attributed to Robert Kennedy. He made it at a speech at the University in Kansas in 1968 when he talked about that GDP measures all the wrong things. It measures sort of progress, but nothing that is really worthwhile. And I think we didn't make any progress on how we could get beyond that in the 50 years past. Now, let me say, I'm excited to welcome three speakers, all of which have been actually in Stockholm for Stockholm Plus 50. So we will not only hear theoretical insights, but also, I hope, some practical reflections on what you have seen. Let me introduce them. So first of all, Professor Joyeeta Gupta, a very well-esteemed colleague of mine who was years back also working at the VU, but now is a professor at the University of Amsterdam. Joyeeta is a professor of environment and development in the Global South, and Joyeeta has so many titles and offices and distinctions that I really cannot name them all. I just want to say that she received recently an ERC grant to look at how we can keep fossil fuels in the ground, and is the editor-in-chief of INEA, a journal of international environmental agreements. Joyeeta, it's very nice to have you today. It's always a pleasure, so welcome. Our second guest today is Eszter Szedlacsek. Eszter is a PhD student at the VU in the Department of Environmental Policy Analysis, and Eszter does research on the intersection of poverty eradication and climate change in the context of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And Eszter is part of a European Marie Curie training network. Eszter, you also have been in Stockholm, just came back. Maybe you're still there, I can see from the background, and welcome to our discussion. Last but not least, I want to welcome Laura de Vries to this discussion. Laura is an ambassador for the European Climate Pact in the Netherlands, but also is part of the Jonge Klimaatbeweging, and translation of that is the Young Climate Movement, which is the umbrella organization that represents youth in the climate debate. And of course, that is so important that I'm really excited that also you, Laura, are here today. And I just checked before, also been actually in Stockholm. So that's all covered. Everyone has been there. I actually haven't, so I'm a bit jealous. And I now want to give the floor to Joyeeta for her introduction and keynote. And that should be 15-20 minutes. And then we will have two brief reflections from Eszter and Laura, and then open up the floor for questions that you might have from the audience. Joyeeta, the floor is yours. And again, very happy to have you.
Thank you. I'm just trying to get my PowerPoint out, and suddenly it has disappeared from my screen. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be able to address you. I'm going to talk a little bit about environmental problems and how we have been trying to solve them over the last 50 years, and why I think that without a just approach, we're not going to be able to get there. For the Stockholm Plus 50 conference, we edited a special issue about lessons learned from international environmental agreements with a number of authors, and we tried to identify what are the key messages from that. However, my presentation will go beyond that. So basically what we see is that environmental problems race far ahead of interstate and national solutions. In 1972, there was a global approach developed in Stockholm, which in many ways built on the idea of limited territorial sovereignty, that the only way we can solve global problems is if we limit the way we use our lands and our territories, and that we take responsibility for our impacts elsewhere in the world. However, in 2015, when the 2030 agenda was adopted, somehow it reverted back to the notion of full permanent sovereignty. So people have been talking in the SDGs about trying to solve global problems and going for partnerships, but at the same time, countries have been very clear about the fact that they're going back to full permanent sovereignty. And why is that? I'll come back and explain that to you. In the meanwhile, between 1972 and 2022, we have hundreds of multi and bilateral treaties between countries, and yet pollution and the resource sharing problem continues. So let me give you an example. Let's take the biodiversity targets that were known as the Aichi targets. There were a whole series of targets that were adopted, and there were two assessments that tried to assess the progress towards this target. One was the IPBES global assessment, and the other was the global biodiversity outlook. And if you look on the right side and you see green, that's the bit that has been achieved. But basically, if you look at the picture, you're basically seeing reds and yellows and blues and grays. And that the message that you get from this is that none of the Aichi targets for biodiversity have been fully met. And then if you look at our impact on nature and you calculate how much is the total mammal biomass on Earth, then all human beings and our livestock, so that's the animals we eat, together we are 2/3 of the total biomass. And then if you look at how much of the biomass is wild animals, it's less than 5%. So basically what we have done is we have taken land over from nature, and we have been colonizing that for our development process. And this is basically one of the key reasons for the loss of biodiversity, but also for things like zoonotic diseases like COVID. So the main point I would like to make is that whether we talk about climate change or biodiversity or nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, or water, essentially we are talking about a shrinking environmental utilization space. So imagine a cake that we have to divide amongst ourselves. And so the big justice question is, how are we going to share this cake? Now, let me give you an example. If you're talking about the biodiversity problem, then we're talking about returning land to nature. But the question is, who has to do this, where in the world, and how? And who's going to pay for this? So this is a really big justice issue. If you look at reducing fossil fuel use, the question is, who has to do this, where in the world, and who pays? And if you look at water use, this is much more regional. And so again, the question comes, who has to reduce? So this is why I think that most environmental problems are about dividing or sharing the resources we have. And so this is a major challenge that we face. So let me give you an example from the climate change issue. I would say the climate change justice issue has 4 takes. One is the take of emission rights. Who has the right to emit? Now, that has not been discussed over the last 30 years. In the beginning, there was this idea that rich countries would take action first, poor countries later. But we've basically done 30 years during which the whole of North America did not accept a legally binding target. And essentially now we have very little space, and we are still not dividing these rights. We basically ask countries to do what they can. And of course, the question of what is development remains unquestioned. Another cake is the cake of resources. So if you look at fossil fuel and you look at where is the fossil fuel located, then what we see is that more than 82% of the remaining fossil fuel is in the global south. So if we have to rapidly phase out fossil fuels, basically we're telling the South, you can't use your resources. And this has been happening over and over again. We've been telling them they can't use their water for dams, they can't deforest. So basically the latecomers land up with stranded resources. And this is a justice problem. The third problem is the issue of stranded assets. And these are the assets that one has to take out, for example, fossil fuels, or the shares one has. And what we are seeing is that Western governments continue to subsidize the export of fossil fuel knowledge and fossil fuel infrastructure to the global South. Western multinationals continue to invest in the global South. Shareholders who are divesting are selling their shares to the global South. And basically what we're trying to do is maximize our revenues from our investments in the global South. And at the same time, we're trying to make sure that if the bubble bursts, the South is left holding the stranded assets. And finally, there is the justice issue of who is going to pay for the adaptation cost, which most people are talking about. So the first three are the ones where we need to spend more time on. Let's talk about water. This is one of my diagram for one of my PhD candidates. And what you see is that in the first phase, so that is in this phase, demand was less than supply. So the rivers were basically in an open phase. Then demand became closer to supply and the rivers were being closed, were in a stage of closing. And then after that, demand has gone up beyond supply, and then you get a closed river basin. And now we have to reopen these river basins. We have to provide enough water for nature and at the same time make sure that we share these resources. So basically, in the Anthropocene, there is no alternative but to share. Now, if I look at the reasons for treaty failure, one of the reasons is the focus on symptoms, not causes. Philipp already mentioned the problem of GDP, and that luckily has finally reached the Secretary General's office, and he announced last week at Stockholm Plus 50 that the GDP concept is out of date. This does not mean that governments accept this yet. Another problem that we see is that nobody is really talking about sharing the pie. They're all talking about market mechanisms, but they're not talking about sharing the pie, and then basically excluding or marginalizing social and sometimes environmental issues. The second is the return to the focus on sovereignty. I mentioned that in relation to Agenda 21, but it's also there in the groundwater agreement that is being discussed in the United Nations. And basically, you're seeing that countries are very scared to open up a discussion of resources within their countries. And there is a massive focus on economic rationality, so market-based instruments, public-private partnerships, etc. There's a focus on easy solutions, so promoting renewables rather than the more difficult challenge of phasing out fossil fuels. And finally, there's been this massive debate over the last 20 years about whether we should address environmental issues first and then social and justice issues, and whether justice issues were just normative ideas that didn't have a scientific basis. And I think those are the reasons for treaty failure. Now, in our special issue, there's a bit of discussion about the fact that there's a diversity of views in different countries, and the only way to solve that is when there is leadership. Now, leadership can be motivated by personal views, by a desire to solve problems, a dissatisfaction with problems, respect for science, and also when public emotion is increased by virtue of seeing the impacts on people. And at the same time, you have laggards, and the laggards are motivated by the fear of policy. And they're also very much motivated by vested interests who profit by externalizing social and environmental issues. And so basically, you're seeing a tussle between the leaders and the laggards tend to win out in the treaty negotiations. And we have a different role for different actors. And what was really exciting about last week's Stockholm conference was the number of young actors present and the number of social justice actors who are present and who are pushing the agenda on justice issues. And of course, there is a debate as to whether states can solve these problems or transnational actors. And in my personal view, when you're sharing a cake, you have to do it with state actors. Transnational actors have to be mobilized as well, but it's much more difficult to share the cake with transnational actors. I'll give you just an example. If you try to impose a particular boundary on a multinational, they have so many ways to avoid that boundary. They can move from one country to another, they can split their assets up, they can transfer their resources. So it's much more difficult to catch a transnational actor than to catch a state actor. Now, in our report, we talk about the number of improvements on treaty design that have taken place. So there's a lot of proliferation of treaties, and these treaties are characterized by fragmentation. So how do we deal with this? You can orchestrate it. You can have memorandums of understanding, thematic clustering. You can try to do better governance by a UN water body, for example. You can help you can get multi-stakeholder partnerships to bridge initiatives. You can get the Secretariat to launch new ideas. And at the same time, when you're designing it, you can try to combine legally binding soft and hybrid agreements. You could try to combine a universal idea with local contextualization, which the SDGs do. But at the same, you can combine a whole series of principles, but at the same time, we see that there is a clash between the polluter pays versus cost sharing, precautionary versus cost effective. So there are problems with our value systems because they sometimes counter each other. You can have targets and timetables, technology transfer, capacity building, financial mechanisms. And what we see from all our research is that environmental treaties are absolutely essential and that we need multiple frames to be able to organize the treaties for adaptive governance. Having said that, economic interests tend to trump environmental and social ones, and environmental and social concerns, in our view, call for a new justice paradigm. So coming back to the shrinking ecospace and how we share this. Now let's look at justice. You have two models, collective action, which is the model of logic of consequences, weighing costs and benefits, focusing on designing carrots and sticks. But what we see here is that this is short-term and nationalistic economics trumps other issues. And we do not have enough carrots and sticks to change everyone's behavior. It's impossible. The social practice model focuses on what is appropriate, tries to come up with legitimacy and authoritative ideas, norms, and tries to encourage people to change their behavior through socialization and routinization. And I think that's where the secret lies, because social practice models don't depend only on carrots and sticks. Now, if you're talking about sharing the ecospace, we're trying to put the last first, as is required by the SDG agenda. So let's look at access to minimum resources: water, land, food, energy, infrastructure. But firstly, if you actually try to meet the minimum in an unchanged world, you will cross planetary boundaries. We've done calculations which demonstrate this. So therefore, you have to change the world if you want to meet the SDGs. Secondly, if this cake is small and it is shrinking, then the price of clean resources keeps going up. And this basically marginalizes the poor. Either they cannot afford it, or they're forced into distressed sales of their land, or they're exposed to pollution. This is the first part, the access. The second part is the allocation of remaining resources. Markets and technologies can do that, but they need to be subject to some kind of justice rules. Otherwise, you'll get very thin market justice, which basically benefits the rich. And then, of course, you have to deal with risks through the precautionary principle or through liability. And then you have to look at responsibilities and make those who cause the problem or have resources pay. So in conclusion, 10 years ago, scholars made a very strong aim that we must separate environmental from justice issues. They said, let's solve the environment, then we'll do all the others. But that's not going to work, and that's very clear also from the SDGs. Moreover, scholars focused on market mechanisms because they thought the market will solve everything. And we now know that the market is unable to actually get the kinds of results we need because a market cannot share the cake except by providing resources for the rich. My argument also is that by focusing on win-win solutions, focusing on renewables, we didn't look at fossil fuels carefully. And therefore, this means we cannot address climate change. There's no way we will be able to induce developing countries to phase out the use of the fossil fuels they have within their own borders. And if we put a border tax control, that will be not enough, because there are enough developing countries that can export and import to each other. I think industrialized countries have dragged their feet in addressing the climate change problem, and this has exacerbated existing justice problems. And my conviction is that without a just approach, there may be no way to address climate change, or in fact, any of the other environmental problems. And this is what we are trying to work on in the Earth Commission. And that is why I was so happy to see so many young people present at Stockholm Plus 50 who were really pushing the justice agenda and the need to address the environmental issue. But in many ways, young people must also realize that we're talking about a limited cake. And so it's going to be quite complicated to try and address these issues for present and future generations. Thank you.
Fantastic, Joyeeta. Thanks so much. And as always, very inspiring, very lucid, very provocating also. So I just want to briefly pick up some key points and summarize before I ask from our two other speakers their reflections. I think it was very important to hear you speak so clearly about the importance of social justice as a key concept in environmental governance. And that's, of course, really important. And it seems to me is becoming really much more debatable, which I think is a good thing. But you were also talking about the difficulty of sharing the cake. And we all know that the usual reaction to sharing a cake is just to make more cake, because then you actually don't share. And this doesn't work anymore. So it's not only that we need to share, the cake is getting smaller if we take into account what you said about the limits that exist in nature. So actually, I'm quite skeptical about the idea that governments will do that, because what I observe is there is a lot of policy capture of governments. Why is it that governments delay and delay? It's because there are vested interests that actually control governments. Governments might look like they're independent, but they might not be. So against this backdrop, you have multiple times said that the future might be the young generation, the youth movement, which I think is a really positive and hopeful thought. But of course, as you said, one that needs to be scrutinized. So I'm inviting now two representatives of this youth to speak to us. And I want to start with Eszter. And of course, I already mentioned that you have been in Stockholm. So I would be, first of all, interested in possibly having been one of your first UN meetings. What were your observations? What surprised you, maybe? And what did you, in general, take from that meeting? The feeling that you got. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that. Eszter, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Philipp, and also thanks for the Amsterdam Sustainability Institute for inviting me to this panel. So yes, I have been there at Stockholm last week. It was actually a pretty great experience. I haven't ever been to a COP or a climate summit before, so it was quite decisive as well. Well, my general experiences are that while Stockholm Plus 50 did not disguise itself as a summit that was actually taking action, so they did not advertise the summit as having concrete points for transformative action, but I still expected more action besides the urgency. So in general, I got the feeling of urgency at the participant level as well, and also the side event, plenary and leadership dialogues. So there was an emphasis on how we have not achieved a lot of things that were described in the Stockholm Declaration 50 years ago, which are still quite alarmingly, very significantly present and persistent problems still today. But there was a lot of focus on the science policy interface, and I would like to just briefly make three main points. And first of it is related to this science policy interface that I mentioned just now. So what we did not have in 1972 at Stockholm was the enormous amount of science available that is available to us now. But have we used it? Have we used it in the past 50 years? And have we used it at Stockholm Plus 50? I argue not to its fullest potential. So we did have practitioners at Stockholm Plus 50 But I do believe that while recommendations have been made by the scientific community, also by the scientific report that was prepared for Stockholm Plus 50 by SEI and also CEEW, which was a great report putting forward great recommendations. But we are not quite sure that a dialogue has happened between practitioners and between these academic community and scientific advisors, basically. So we need more on how these could actually, the science input could actually be implemented and executed, because there are, of course, lots of political factors. And I still believe that these were not really mentioned or realized at Stockholm Plus 50, maybe by the nature of international conferences and summit in general, maybe for some other reasons, but we do need to tackle this to turn urgency into action. So my second point, it relates to Professor Gupta's point on environmental justice. And I was also really, really happy to see a lot of youth representatives and a lot of people working on environmental justice. But at the same time, I do have to mention that while we were there, me and two fellow PhDs from the FU, we talked to a lot of participants and besides side events and in general. And some of them have mentioned that a lot of people have not been able to come to the event because of practical reasons, visa issues. They have applied for visas months before the conference and they have not been approved. So this comes to a point when we are still talking about the very severe impacts that environmental damage has on these communities, but they are still not represented equally at these meetings. And also there were a large amount of side events, which I actually really applauded. I was really happy to see indigenous communities and representatives present at side events on these very important topics. But not many other stakeholders were invited to these panels. And I felt like they are represented, but are their points actually taken into account when making policies? Or are they there as some form of slight tokenism, which is of course a very harsh expression to say, but I was just wondering. So this is basically my second point. And my third point is that it relates to my research area as well. And I did go there as a PhD researcher, basically to observe how different intersecting policy areas are represented at international summits. And so I argue that how we tackle complex and interrelated policy problems at these conferences, it needs to be changed. And I did see some concrete developments at Stockholm Plus 50, and I was really happy to see them. There were specific concrete side events that focus on interrelations and interconnections between policy fields. And this reflects the fact that the problems, the biophysical and socioeconomic problems that we have today, they are not taking place in a policy vacuum, and therefore they cannot be solved by siloed approaches. And this was acknowledged to a certain extent at the conference. So there were sentences like a good climate COP should have direct impacts on other frameworks such as biodiversity and other policy fields. But I feel like there is not a lot of acknowledgement that this comes with a price, and this comes with multiple prices. So first, there is a little acknowledgement that this is actually a conflict. So we are not, it's very non-likely that we're going to implement things at the same time without any sort of conflict. And let me just give a practical example to this. So basically in 1972 at the original Stockholm, after that, there was basically common understanding that externalities have to be governed and have to be managed and have to be regulated. And after that, we arrived at some sort of semi-solution, which was the corporate voluntary action. But now we know that this does not work. The corporate voluntary action does not work. The externalities are almost bigger than ever before. It's a huge problem. But at the same time, we have not mentioned it at the conference. We are still keeping elephants in the room without addressing them. And we do not mention that this is an apparent conflict and that we cannot have unlimited economic growth and poverty elimination and environmental goals succeeding. We still believe that by adopting certain technological advancements, we can have unlimited growth, but we cannot. And it seems to me that at the summit, we are not very likely to accept this. And I think to turn urgency into action, we need to accept that we need to not only integrate policies and not only harmonize policies, because that means basically cherry picking and choosing the goals that are not conflicting with each other and turning them into one agenda. We do not need to do that. We need to solve the underlying conflicts that exist, and we need to be conscious about it. Yes, I think these are my main points.
Thank you, Eszter, very much for those reflections, also pointing to really important cross-cutting questions about the science-policy interface, the relevance of social justice, but also what you just outlined, the silo approach and how we can actually integrate things. And I was really triggered by your observation that there's an elephant in the room, that we still operate with terms such as green growth, which seems to be a weird concept. It seems to me like a bit with smoking. We know that smoking is bad and we ban cigarettes, but we allow just other things that we call electronic cigarettes, but basically keeping everything the same. Good. Really interesting and really fascinating. Lots of questions I have. I want to allow our third speaker to enter the discussion, Laura. And one thing that I wanted is, just briefly before Stockholm, the week before, there was the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos. And some people say you should go there because that's where the power is. That's where all these companies hang out. And I'm not sure if you were there, but you also decided to go to Stockholm. So why do you think is a meeting of governments and international meetings still important? And could you maybe reflect a bit on what you saw and if you're hopeful for the future based on what you have seen? Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, first, I think it's important to stress that I wasn't invited to Davos, so I didn't have a choice. But to be really honest, if we had to make the choice, I don't know if we would have gone to Davos, because for us as youngsters, it's always really important to think about where can we make the most impact. And I think for us that Stockholm was a place where we could make more impact, also because it's smaller. So Davos is a really, really big place, like really large venues and that kind of stuff. And of course you have like also side events. And but I think the Stockholm conference was also, compared to the COP26, really small. So it was really easy to just address policymakers and governments. So I think that was really nice. Also, I think for us, it's really important to address those governments, and it's really important that those international meetings keep happening. To be honest, I think a lot of time it's a lot of talking and saying the things we already know are important and stressing the same things. But either way, I think it's really important to keep stressing those things. So when we won't do those meetings anymore and we won't be there, and we as governments, we say it's not important enough for us and we won't go there, I think that will also decrease the importance we give to those subjects. So for example, nature and the environment. So I think those meetings, even though I don't think they will really increase the ambition of countries, are really important to just keep the ambition at all. So when you say as the world, we don't do these meetings anymore, we are not going to these meetings anymore, you can indirectly you will indirectly make it less important. So it won't, like, it is of course like these are subjects from the Sustainable Development Goals, and when you will give less attention to some of these goals, then you're just saying we as a country think other things are more important. So I think it's really important that those conferences on these subjects are really still happening. But I was a bit sad, to be really honest, because I had really big hopes for Stockholm, also because it was smaller. But I think it's really important that there were more youngsters, and there really were more youngsters than ever. But in terms of impact, I'm questioning the impact we made there. So, for example, we as youngsters kept addressing youth participation. I think that really did make an impact. So, for example, there was a side event, and I stressed, I asked a question, to be fair, about youth participation, and that did change like the conversation. So I think it's really important that we are still going there, that we are still asking these questions and doing these conferences. But yeah, like I think someone already said it, but I'm not sure. Like in these 50 years, only 10% of all the things that were on the agenda were really like fulfilled. So that's really sad. And the things we're saying right now at those conferences were also being said like 50 years ago. And of course, some subjects are more on our agendas right now. So for example, the climate action and biodiversity are bigger topics than they were ever. But still, I believe that, like, I was in a lot of side events and also in the plenary sessions. A lot of times it felt for me like I kept hearing like a record on repeat. And on the one hand, that's really good. But on the other hand, it wasn't, because for me, it felt like we're still saying the same things, but do we really find this important? So the three things I really heard a lot were the importance of youth participation, indigenous people, and like also making sure women are being heard. I think those three are really important, and we're like as youngsters fighting for these subjects a long time. So I think it's really nice that they're saying it a lot of times, but on the other hand, they've been saying it like for 50 years. So for me, it was really confirming that they were saying it again, and they were like mentioning these three subjects. But on the other hand, I hope that they will also put it into action. Yeah, so to summarize what I'm saying, I think it's really good that we're still doing these conferences. I don't know if on this conference itself, we're really making a change. But I think if we're not doing the conferences, we really have a problem. So it's good that we are doing it. And I also think it's really good that we're still saying things like youth participation is important and that there were a lot of youngsters. I do think that we should stress our governments in general to take more action and also put say do what you say. And for the Netherlands, to be honest, they did bring a lot of youngsters, so kudos to them. But I don't know if that's the same for all other countries. Last, I would like to say that I do think that these conferences are interesting for another subjects. It just came to mind because a lot of governments go like into separate rooms with each other and talk about things. So we're not seeing it, but I talked to the youth representatives that went with our delegation, and they went into like bilaterals, and they said that a lot of things are happening there. So that's really interesting because you won't see it on the if you're just a normal participant, but the delegations do go into rooms with each other and talk about making progress. But you won't see it, but it's happening there. And for them, it's really easy to see each other there and like say, hey, let's go into a room and talk about it. So that's also a thing why I think those conferences are really important and may make a change on that subject. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura, for these words and the very important reminder indeed that these conferences have many functions. One is probably just keeping up the ambition and reminding us that those are important problems and asking us, making a call to action. But also, I found it really interesting what you just mentioned, actually enabling multilateralism, enabling countries, in particular, when you think about other problems that we have right now in the world, to come together and to speak to each other seems to be crucially important if you want to address any of those challenges. Now, I think that was really, really interesting, very inspiring already. I want to bring in the audience, and I want to do it by asking a bit of a generic question that people might latch onto, but you can have your own questions and we open up then to our panel to address those. But I was thinking, I think we all agree that we do have enough evidence. The science is there and we can do more science, but it's pretty solid. So we know that. It also seems to be that at least at the symbolic level, at what we all say, everyone is willing more or less to accept that we need to do something, but it seems not to be sufficient. So what is actually hindering governments, but also other actors to actually practice what they preach? And what could we do about that? There were already some ideas, but I was really asking you, all smart people, we're here in this virtual room, it's now the time to come up with some radical ideas. And I want to do it in the following way. I want to give the opportunity to each of our panelists to make a half-minute short reaction or statement, and then I will open up for our audience to ask questions. Joyeeta, I want to come back to you because you started so.
I just want to come back on your science point. I think there's enough natural science, but when we were doing our special issue, there's not enough evidence to demonstrate that the market mechanisms failed. So what's happening is that the people who write about market mechanisms are either economists who demonstrate that it works in a limited sort of fashion, or it is political ecologists who just destroy the idea but do not give quantitative evidence of its failure. So I think there's a lot of work for social scientists to actually move from a normative story or rhetorical storyline to give evidence. That's the first point. The second point is what I also put on the screen is Stockholm did not get a mandate actually from the United Nations to do more than just host an event. So that also limited them. And so they focused essentially on mobilizing space for other actors. But to come back to Laura's point, you know, when you invite all kinds of other actors and they say things, how do you convince your parliament back at home that what all these other actors are saying is important? And this is a very big challenge for these people. So actually your challenge, Laura, in my view, is to put pressure on the Dutch government, because the Dutch government still continues to finance, say, fossil fuels in the developing world. So the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands also has all kinds of conflicts with other ministries. So the social movements have to come back home and put pressure on their own governments.
Yeah, can I answer?
Yeah, please, exactly. Go ahead, or answer right away.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I totally agree with you, Joyeeta. And for me, as a board member of the Dutch Youth Climate Movement, board member Public Affairs to be complete, I think we are really busy doing that. So we are really talking to our government and politics a lot of times about these subjects. So to also put our words into action and to make sure they are ambitious and more ambitious also than other countries, because we have a responsibility. So I think we're already doing it a lot of times. We also have like a We Are Tomorrow Global Partnership. It's a partnership of us with other countries. So for example, Chile, Bangladesh, India, and other countries, where we as Youth Climate Movement, really try to address our own governments in our own countries, but also make a global vision document, which you can take to, for example, the COP27. So we're also, I think, in our own ways at every country trying to pressure our government to take more action. But I think it's also a thing about, for example, we as the Dutch partnership in the global partnership, for us it's really easy access to our government. So I think for a lot of other persons from other countries, it's really hard to have access to their government and their politics, and sometimes also more sensitive. So I think we as Western countries have the responsibility to make sure we really pressure our governments to take their action, and talk with other youngsters from other governments to talk with them about how they can do it in their own context. So I totally agree with you. I think we're already doing a lot of that as youngsters. I think we already also could do a lot more. But it's also a matter of capacity.
Thank you, Laura. Yeah, very important reminder of all the good work that's already happening. And also really important to understand that indeed we are in the Netherlands quite privileged in the sense that there is access to the government to some degree at least, and some responsibility and accountability. Eszter, I want to also invite you in for a short reflection, what we have heard before we open up to our audience. Eszter, any thoughts to share?
Yes, I just wanted to reflect on what Professor Gupta just said, that we need to focus more on what hasn't worked. So we have a tendency to focus on best practices and lessons learned, but we don't have a tendency to focus on what failed enormously and why it has failed. And I think there needs to be more reflections on that. I just wanted to add an interesting perspective that I heard during one of the side events, which also reflects to what Laura said. is that basically now the work begins. We just had Stockholm, we had a nice conference. It's not the work itself. We have to go home, we have to go back home and do the work. So that's a really good perspective. I think that that most of the work happens at home with advocacy and with reaching out and pressuring certain groups. And maybe just one more point is that also an interesting experience from Stockholm Plus 50 at one of the side events. The director, I think, of the European Environment Agency was present, and he actually had quite open views about environmental justice and reflected on some of the root causes that cause problems, environmental damages, and also preventing sustainable development. And I asked a very provocative question, because I usually do, and so I asked, if you, as the leader of the European Environment Agency, have these views, why do not implement them in practice, actually? Because the EU still does sign treaties, agreements that have very damaging effects. It has environmental impact assessments, but these are not comprehensive, so they do not tackle the root causes. And he said, what I think most of the actors that do something say is that, we have done so much, why do you expect us to do everything? And I'm sure these were not the exact words that he used. I'm not quoting him. It's just, we have done this, we have done that. The EU has been a leader in this. Why do you expect us to do even more? And I think we just need to realize that we need to do everything at the same time, because otherwise it's not going to happen. Like, this is a huge crisis. We're not going to make it work if we do not do everything, all of us at the same time.
Thank you, Eszter, and a very important reminder that although probably Europe is doing okay on some of those aspects, it doesn't mean that we need to stop or could stop. So I am very intrigued by all the things I heard, but of course, really looking forward to questions and views from the audience. So there are two ways to do this. Either is you raise your hand and you get the floor, or you put a comment or a question in the chat, and then we will relay this back to our speakers. So is there anyone who wants to share a view or ask a question to our three speakers?
Yeah, we have one question here from Patricia Lago, who writes that, she has the impression that there are most laggards and that nothing happens unless the key stakeholders are not compelled to take action. So her question then is how to activate the laggards.
So the question is, who is the laggard? If it is the government rather than the vested interests, so the vested interests are the ones that persuade the government to be a laggard. And of course, the government is looking at the impacts on GDP. But basically, if you want to change the perspective of the government, you really have to put pressure on the parliament. So you have to get the parliament to ask the government uncomfortable questions, and you have to get the social movements. But one thing I didn't say during my presentation is that social movements are using courts now to address many issues. We have 1,700 court cases on climate change. But even the social movements can stop governments in some ways or stop companies. What we are seeing is that fossil fuel companies are now suing governments for closing them down. So and the fossil fuel companies are asking governments to compensate them for their loss of income. So this makes the courts a very complicated process because it is leading to policy freezing. So governments are also afraid of the huge bills they're going to get when they try to close down a particular factory or a particular company. And so somehow we have to try to change this dynamic also to put pressure on governments.
Yeah, thank you. Philipp disappeared, but we have another question here from Sunny from the Philippines, and he's asking, so scientists have been discussing adaptation since early 2000s and stating that implementation of adaptation is a governance issue, which requires collective actions. So the actual question is, how can it be guaranteed that adaptation measures will not be used by the government to prolong or even justify their inactions on the international goals to tackle root causes?
So, for me, mitigation is the primary adaptation measure. If you don't mitigate, you're going to have to adapt for another 1,000 years. That's the first point. The second point is, I have the feeling that for developing country governments, it's not a question of saying, let's do adaptation, let's do mitigation, let's do development. It really needs to be integrated. And I think for a lot of these countries, I mean, I'll give you an example. I had a student who wanted to do a national adaptation plan of action research in Nepal. And when she arrived over there, the adaptation was to happen in a particular village, but there was no drinking water. So in effect, the adaptation project was just to provide drinking water, which is not an adaptation project. And so essentially what we need to do in many of these cases is to visualize what is the development that we want for our country that is affordable for our country, and that is within the limits, and not to keep thinking that you're going to get massive investment from other countries, because when people come with investments, they also want you to pay a high interest rate in foreign currency. So, you know, a lot of the developing countries and a lot of the social justice movements are asking for finance. Now, if that finance comes as a grant, that may be okay, but it will increase inflation. But nevertheless, that's fine. But the problem is, if that finance is coming in as investment, which is what I am hearing, then that's very risky, because the more risky, the more politically insecure your country, the higher the interest rate, and therefore the higher the challenges for your country to pay back that interest. So, you know, we have to be very careful in developing countries how we organize this. And we need to get our development, mitigation, and adaptation and biodiversity and nutrient and food security strategies really well understood before we start spending lots of money in trying to emulate the Dutch, for example, and create a major adaptation strategy. Because that's not affordable.
I think that's a really, really important point and fantastic question, by the way. I think another reminder that we need to very quickly get out of the silo approach and really try to move towards integration, but also at the same time understand that this is embedded in a certain configuration of economic interests. Because when you look about this 100 billion that are to be given to climate, for example, a lot of this is actually meant to be investments from the private sector. And with cheap money, we're still in a relatively cheap money regime, economically speaking. You will also invest in totally useless adaptation measures because it doesn't cost you anything. So this is another risk that needs to be taken into account. So I think it's an excellent question and a really very good answer. Do we have more thoughts that we can relate to our three speakers? Because we have a couple of minutes, to be precise, 8 minutes before we have to close. Neela, are there some more questions in the chat?
Yeah, Vali just puts one more. Do you think there are more governments and stakeholders than we think that are taking action, or at least considering about tackling sustainability issues, but are maybe strategically phasing them in? And then there's a second question. How do you think conflicts such as the Russia-Ukraine influence the priority dedicated to sustainability? So it's two very different questions.
So let's do it in the following way. Let's start with Laura in the short reflection. You can pick and choose which of the questions you want to answer. And please be within a minute, maybe we can go round one time for all the speakers. Laura.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I didn't get the questions.
I wrote them really badly, I have to say. Sorry.
Okay. You ask them directly, Vali.
Yeah, sorry. I basically wanted to say, like, how likely do you think it is that governments are actually thinking about this, but they don't just want to do a U-turn and change everything immediately? Like, how realistic do you think it is that they already have some ideas in mind and they're just phasing them in, as opposed to not taking action at all? And then, yeah, just how the Russia-Ukraine and particularly wars within the democratic sphere influence how committed people are to prioritizing.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions. First, I think it depends on the government. So, for example, the Dutch government, I think they're really busy with sustainability policy on the moment. I think the biggest, and I think for other governments, it depends on the country. So I think governments in general do have climate change on their agenda. I think subjects like that are affiliated, such as biodiversity and circular economy, are really less on the agenda, but climate change is on the agenda. I'm sure of it. Also because countries realize a lot that not doing anything about climate change will affect their economy and their safety, and it will affect them on so many ways. So if they don't do it now, they will be, as their country, they will have problems in the future. So I think they want to take their responsibility, sometimes for the good reasons, sometimes for economical reasons maybe, but I think it's on their agenda for sure. To your question, second question about how I think conflicts such as the Russia-Ukraine conflict influences things. When I, for example, look at the Netherlands, you see that the war that's going on right now is influencing things, because we're now in an energy crisis. So I think you can go two ways with an energy crisis, and that's what we're seeing in the Netherlands right now. So the one way is saying we have to save a lot of energy right now, and we have to go really fast with making sure we have local green energy for our future really fast, and that the motivation is going up for that. On the other hand, you also see like what someone called fossil fuel reflexes, and that some politicians are scared right now for the energy crisis, and they're saying like we should go to, for example, opening the coal mines again, and maybe we should like get gas from Groningen, a specific area in the Netherlands again. And I think that's really problematic. And I see some nuance. So I really am hopeful for the Netherlands. I can't talk about other contexts and other countries, but for the Netherlands, I am really hopeful, because most parties are saying we should save energy first as the first method. And the second method, we should make sure that we are ready to use coal mines if necessary, but with like, but. So they are really sensitive about using coal, and I'm happy about that. But they do say like we should make it ready for. And then you also have a bit parties like they're saying just go all coal, all gas. But mostly they're saying saving energy first and coals only if really, really, really necessary. And I'm pretty happy about that. So of course, for climate change, coal mines aren't an option at all, and we should just focus on the green energy. But I'm really happy with the pretty nuanced approach from most parties. So yeah, I think it really influences things. I think we all couldn't have seen this coming. So and I really hope all countries will work towards having a green local energy system in their countries because of this. So I hope this will, making a chance of something bad, this will lead to more green energy locally. Yeah, thank you. Sorry for the long answer.
No, great, thanks, Laura. This, I think, really, really good reflections on a totally different, but nonetheless very important topic, the other big problem that we have at the moment, and how they're all intertwined. Looking at the timing, I have to say we have 2 minutes left, so I want to allow Eszter and Joyeeta 1 minute, and I would ask you to come back to Stockholm Plus 50 because that's why we're here. So maybe you can give us a very short closing reflection on some of the things that you took away from both this discussion but also the conference. And please be brief and short. Eszter, the floor is yours, and then I will turn to Joyeeta.
Yes, thank you, Philipp. So my key takeaway is that international conferences and summits are still necessary, and I do believe they can be effective in solving global problems, wicked problems that we face today. But I think that they need to be entirely transformed, and in their current form, they have been functioning like this for 50 years or even more. And in their current form, they are not suitable to address these problems, mainly because of the issues that I mentioned, but also some of the other issues that the other panelists have outlined. So we need new rules and new regulations and a new institutional setting, basically, or not an entirely new one, but a transformed one to face the problems and to address the problems that we face today. But I do think that we still need these summits. So though I am quite pessimistic, I'm still very optimistic about the future. I still think we can do it. We just need concerted effort and to realize the lack of integrated approaches is not going to work.
Thank you, Eszter, and also for reminding us that there probably is some innovation to be made in how we organize international conferences. So if anyone is interested in that, I want to turn back to our keynote speaker, Joyeeta, and give you the floor for the last word that we have today. Joyeeta, what is your take-home message?
I think GDP appears to be questioned even by mainstream actors. And the main challenge for us as scientists is to be able to explain how do we move from here to a different future. And there is not enough research about that. There's a lot of criticism about what's happening, but there is no constructive story about how we move from the current system to a new system. And so that's our job as scholars and NGOs.
Thank you, Joyeeta. And I couldn't have said it nicer myself, as being involved in the Amsterdam Sustainability Institute that actually tries, among many things, but also to provide a platform for different perspectives to come together and develop future scenarios in which not only the economists or not only the natural scientists, but all the disciplines can shine and bring in their knowledge. Thanks again for fantastic speakers, really, really inspiring. And thanks all of you for listening, joining us with your questions, and hopefully welcoming you soon again for another SDG Academy of the Amsterdam Sustainability Institute. Thanks a lot and have a very nice rest of the afternoon.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.